Bitrate refers to the number of bits per frame in a video file. It's measured in megabits per second, and it means that each second has a specific number of bits of data to display it. So a higher bitrate means that each frame has more data, which means it's better quality. It means there's less artifacting, kind of less fuzziness, less noise, but at the expense of that, the file sizes get bigger as the bitrate increases. Codec means coder decoder, and it's a process that tells a program how to read a video file, how to read the data stream that's coming in. There are many different types of codecs used to make video playback more easily, or for the highest quality, or reduced file size, or whatever it is. Cameras can record to a number of different codecs, and then there's also codecs that are for exporting and delivery that have different purposes and different processes dependent on what they're needed for. Both choice of bitrate and choice of codec can determine the end quality of the video file. So a better codec can produce a better quality image, and a worse codec can make it look worse. The same with a bitrate, can make it look better or worse, but they can make them look better and worse in different ways. So I'm going to do some tests to see how choice of codec and choice of bitrate can affect the quality of a video output. So I'm going to export this scene in 4K multiple times. I'm going to export it in H.264 and Prores. In H.264 I'm going to export it at 100 megabits per second, 20 megabits per second, and 5 megabits per second. In Prores I'm going to export it Prores HQ and Prores Proxy. H.264 is a popular codec for online use, so for YouTube videos, Vimeo films, things on websites. It's a decent quality codec, but it's kind of lossy, which means it loses a lot of data, but it can obviously compress it into a smaller file size, so it's very easy to upload online and that kind of thing. Whereas ProRes is a more professional standard codec. It's developed by Apple and it's made as an intermediate codec, which means that it's not really meant for delivery or exporting. It's more meant for recording to and storing files as ProRes that can be then edited within a post-production workflow. There's different types of ProRes. There's ProRes HQ, 422, LT, and Proxy. These are all 422, but HQ is the top codec that has a bitrate of 737 megabits per second, whereas ProRes Proxy is designed to be a proxy codec, so it's easy to work with, easy to play back in an editing software, and that has a bitrate of 151 megabits per second. So 5 video files, H.264 100 megabits, H.264 20 megabits, H.264 5 megabits, ProRes HQ and ProRes Proxy. Looking at the bit rates of the ProRes codec and the bit rates I'm exporting the H.264 codec as, you'd expect that the ProRes HQ one will be the top because that's the best codec and it's also 700 megabits per second. Then you'd actually expect the ProRes Proxy to be a little bit better than the H.264s because it's still 151 megabits per second, which is obviously a little bit higher than the H.264 at 100 megabits. And then you'd expect that the H.264s would decrease in quality as you go down from 100 to 20 to 5 megabits per second. 5 megabits per second in 4K, you'd imagine, I expect it to look pretty bad, to have some horrible noise and some artifacting and blocky edges and fuzzy detail and stuff like that. So after looking at the results of these 5 exports, all of them actually look pretty similar. So the ProRes doesn't look that different to the H.264, and all of the scale of bit rates don't look that different. The only one that really stands out if you were watching it just as an audience member is probably the 5 megabits per second, because that one, it does look a bit softer and a bit scruffier. There's not as much detail there. A lot of the fine detail in highlights and shadows is lost to the compression. So that's the only one that I'd say you can see if you're just watching it as a viewer. And then you can zoom in and kind of see the difference between 100 megabits H.264 and 20 megabits H.264, but you can only really see that if you're pixel peeping, if you're really zooming in and looking at these specific areas to see the change. But when you're watching it as a viewer on a TV or a big screen, you can't really tell that much. On a small screen especially, maybe you'd even get away with using the 5 megabits per second. Having said that, ProRes HQ is definitely the best. Like, if you're really zooming in and looking at it, you can tell that one is the clearest and the sharpest. But again, on a small screen especially, there's barely any difference. On a big screen, maybe you could tell the difference between the ProRes and the H.264, but not really. Especially the ProRes Proxy to the H.264 100 megabits. There's only 50 megabits per second of difference in those files, but the Prores proxy doesn't look a great deal better than the H.264. They're very similarly matched, and definitely if you're just watching it as a viewer without knowing what to look for or where to look, I don't think you notice. Having said that, everything gets recompressed when it goes online, so if you upload into YouTube or Vimeo, it all gets compressed again to be easy to stream for every kind of computer or internet. So you can export something at massive ProRes HQ 700 megabits, but that's going to take up a hell of a lot of data on a hard drive, when if it's going onto YouTube or Vimeo, it's going to get compressed down anyway. So YouTube compresses all HD 25p video down to 8 megabits per second, and all 4K uploads between 35 and 45, whereas Vimeo compresses 1080 down to 10 megabits per second and compresses 4K to 30 to 60. So Vimeo has a slightly better bitrate compression. It compresses things less than YouTube does, but it's all not that great of a difference. And judging by what I've found from this experiment is that the difference between how Vimeo looks and how YouTube looks, by the numbers, shouldn't really be that different. But there obviously is a reason why people would upload their films to Vimeo rather than YouTube, because Vimeo does compress them less, and YouTube does, especially in 1080, compresses it a lot more. What is noticeable from these exports though is the file size and how the bitrate and codec can change that drastically. The smallest one at 80 megabytes is the H.264 5 megabits per second, followed by the H.264 20 megabits per second, which is 300 megabytes. And then the next one is actually the ProRes proxy, which is technically got a higher bitrate than the H.264 100 megabits, but the ProRes proxy is 1.2 gigabytes, and the H.264 100 megabits per second is 1.4 gigabytes. So a little bit of a difference there in file size, even though the H.264 is actually slightly worse of a quality than the ProRes proxy. The biggest is the ProRes HQ, which is drastically bigger than any of the others, and that is 8.8 gig. So you can go from this ProRes HQ, which is 8.8 gig, down to 80 megabytes for the H.264 5 megabits per second. And that one is noticeable. So the only one that's not noticeable, that if you were watching it on a phone especially, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference that much between ProRes HQ and H.264 20 megabits per second, and the difference between those, it goes from 300 meg on the H.264 to 8,800 meg on the ProRes HQ. So there's a massive difference in file size. So that's something to bear in mind, is that like storing these files on a hard drive when they're these crazy big codecs and bit rates, if you can't tell that much of a difference, it might be a waste of storage, more so than it'll be a sacrifice in video quality for the end output. This was my presentation on how bitrates and codecs can affect the final quality of a video output from visual inspection. Thank you for listening.